John Blossom, and the clock has started.
Hi, I'm Peter Propp. Welcome to 10 Minute Strategy. Today we're talking with John Blossom, President of Shore Communications. We'll be talking about content aggregation strategies and how to succeed with them in online media for consumers and enterprises. So John, first off, what is aggregation and why is it so important?
Thanks, Peter. Aggregation is really important. It's about bringing content together from many different sources and curating it, trying to give it some value in context, and then delivering it, providing it in a place where audiences want to consume it. This is what publishers have done for years, of course.
Right, and it seems like that's what everybody's doing on the internet these days. It's a pretty basic 101 internet business. So what's important about aggregation these days?
Well, what's important for some of the major publishers especially to understand is how to do aggregation cost effectively in a way that's going to drive revenues and build audience at the same time so you can have a good base for recurring revenues. And so there are issues of control and cost effectiveness that really need to come into play here. It's harder for people to make money controlling a collection of content. And many publishers are just beginning to recognize that licensing content from everywhere to aggregate it is a pretty expensive option. And it provides a lot of limits to the collection that they're putting out there for people to boot. And as you said, Google's been out there and many other people for years challenging this idea that you can curate one little pot of content and make it so valuable that people are going to pay tons of money for it.
Right.
Instead, they say get tons of content to be able to find stuff from that ton of content that's really valuable for people in very specific contexts. Yahoo kind of failed with the old strategy as well. Initially, they said, well, we're going to license the good content. And they found that was really hard on their profit margins. They just couldn't afford to go out there and do a lot of things that companies like Google were doing. In the enterprise space, it was hard too, because you had companies historically like Dialog, lots of folks that were licensing the same content, aggregating in their databases, but none of them could really afford to put enough value on top of those databases to differentiate them from their competitors.
Right.
You know, so it's no surprise that a lot of those companies have been aggregated themselves into other companies because they just couldn't afford to provide enough value.
Right, they sort of created this walled-off garden, and people weren't finding them within their garden.
People weren't finding them, and when they did go to the gardens, they found pretty much the same stuff that they did in the other gardens. It's like having two supermarkets right next to one another.
Right.
I can pick up my box of cereal here, I can pick my box of cereal up there. What's the difference?
And then you end up with an end-user experience where they're logging into something, get deep into it, they don't find what they need, and then they have to go all the way back out, go somewhere else to
find that one little snippet of stuff that wasn't in that particular collection.
Right.
And other folks in media find that problem as well. Newspapers, wire services, people want to find good content wherever they want it, not necessarily because it happens to be where you want to put it.
Right. So what do you think the keys are to creating a successful aggregation strategy for publishers today?
Well, I think there are 4 key strategies that are going to help to drive revenues and audience. Number 1, choosing your focus. You can't do everything in aggregation the way that you used to. Number 2, engaging your audience. Number 3, think about what's going to be driving your revenues more flexibly. And number 4, make sure that audiences themselves are part of your content strategy.
Right, so on focus, when I think about that, I think about maybe what are my strengths and where are their opportunities? What does my audience need that they're not getting today? Is that what you mean by focus?
Well, yeah, and in the process of doing that, you have to decide what aspects of aggregation are really important both to your audience and your revenue strategy. There's several things that we detailed in our paper, The New Aggregation, that are components of aggregation. It's a bit of a longer list, but I'm going to tick it off. We have commercial supplier agreements, curating a collection, normalizing the content, value add, indexing, storage, retrieval, access control, and distribution. Now, the truth of the matter is that that's an awful lot. That's a big pyramid.
Yeah.
And there's just so much content out there, most people just can't afford to do it right these days. So you have to pick your battles and recognize you have partners and your customers. They're going to help you do these things and get the content in a place where people say, aha, that's valuable. Right. One place where many folks in the enterprise space are finally beginning to open up is in the idea of application programming interfaces.
Right.
And finally recognizing that their customers and their partners have more ability to create more value for their content than they do. They can only go out there and research so many different opportunities that are niche enough that people are going to say, wow, that's really valuable and I'm going to pay for that. So a company like Elsevier, for example, that does scientific and technical publishing, they recently opened up an API to their content for their partners and their customers. So now within that field where you have many different sorts of needs within the scientific and technical community, you can have dozens of applications flowering out there rather than just a few. And of course on the consumer side, we see that with companies like Google and Apple that have gone out there and provided software development toolkits and APIs to make it possible to develop applications on their platforms, rather than saying that Apple or Google has to come along and invent every single application that's going to be useful for my content.
So it's really a services approach, as in web services, where now I've got my content, I'm going to enable it, I'm going to open up an API or a service, and when I do that, I can protect my revenue stream, but I'm also going to build my brand.
Absolutely. Because ultimately content is a service. It's about information and experiences getting to the place where people decide that it's valuable.
Right.
So, so being able to do that is important. Engaging your audience, obviously, is really the end net result of all that.
Right.
You know, your brand is not a cereal box.
Right.
A brand is a trusted relationship. And when people say, gee, I trust content company X to deliver what I want, then that's really when you have them in a place where you're going to drive revenues.
Right. What about revenue model concerns? People are going crazy. They're saying, I can't let this go. That's how I make my money. I've made my money that way for 30, 40 years.
Or more. Some people even 100 years or more.
Right.
And they're tied to the idea that this is the way that I've sold content for decades.
Right.
And you don't necessarily have to tie your revenue model to those old revenue models. And folks are beginning to recognize this. And one of the big things that a more flexible aggregation strategy provides you is more opportunities to drive revenues through more models. So you may not necessarily be saying, well, I have just subscription for the paper version and licensing content out to databases. All of a sudden you have all sorts of middle grounds where ad-supported content looks more interesting.
Right.
And more opportunities to provide value for things that are more about marketing than advertising. That is the ability for people to be able to say, well, wait a minute, you've got that space on that page. I could put content there that's very interesting to your customers, kind of in the way that I used to do advertising.
Right.
So all of a sudden aggregation becomes not just subscription or ad, but a lot of in-between things as well, including applications.
Mobile applications.
Mobile apps are a huge opportunity for revenues, and people kind of turned their nose up at that for many years, or tried to do it the old style through licensing agreements. But today in mobile, we see people making $2, $5, sometimes more than $5 a shot on some of these apps that people find useful, convenient, and that drives satisfaction.
And we've seen GQ magazine and others where the app is actually an issue of the magazine that's now on my iPhone or on my
whatever it takes to get that information from your audience, to get that metadata that helps you understand them and satisfy them. That's the key to be able to drive a good aggregation strategy.
Right, and that leads to the last idea, which is empowering. How do you make sure that your consumer actually is going to find your content now that you've opened up to all these new services? It's about metadata, I assume.
It's about metadata and also allowing your audience to drive you to where the content is going to be most valuable. Let your audiences develop content within your aggregation scheme so that they can help you in this curation, indexing, and discovery process.
Well, that's a timer.
That's the timer. Looks like we're running out of time.
Yeah, so just a final idea on the audience. The importance of the audience is probably the most important aspect, right? I know my target audience, I'm going to build content to make it available to them, and then I need to let them know about all my new tools and my new opportunities.
It's all about the aha. It's not about the package.
Right. Excellent. Well, for 10 Minute Strategy, this is Peter Propp. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks very much.